Well, welcome everybody to the School of Political Science and International Studies seminar series. This is our second for first semester in 2018, and we're very delighted to welcome Dr. Lea Kent to speak to us today about her research. Lea is a fellow in the School of Regulation and Global Governance, otherwise known as RegNet, at the ANU. And a member of the Centre for International Governance and Justice as well. She has research interests in transitional justice, memory studies, peace building, peace and conflict studies, more generally, remembrance, reconciliation and justice in peace and conflict-afflicted societies, let's say. She's also someone that I have done a little bit of work with and had fun on, as attending workshops together and being on panels together. So I'm really delighted that she's here, and because of that connection I asked Eloise if I could also chair the seminar today. So yeah, I'm very excited to welcome Lea to the school and to introduce her to all of you. And she's going to talk to us today. Oh, I should say something about her publications, I guess, because she has a very long list of publications. A very beautiful book. Where's the title of your book, Lea? Oh, no, it's here. It's here. After Conflict.
Oh,
No, that's not it. Sorry, everyone.
2012. There we are.
The Dynamics of Transitional Justice, International Models and Local Realities in East Timor. She has published in the International Journal of Transitional Justice, Australian Journal of International Affairs, also International Feminist Journal of Politics, to name only a few. Third World Thematics, I believe. We have, she has a very good article with a fantastic co-author. And a range of other fantastic work. But she's also working, this research that she's presenting today was funded through a DECRA, ARC DECRA scholarship, and it's, the project's called After Conflict, Local Memories and Nation Building in Timor-Leste and Aceh, not Bougainville. Sorry. Anyway, I will let her tell you more about all the fascinating things she's been doing.
Well, thank you so much, Nikki, for that very warm and generous introduction. And thanks also to Eloise for inviting me here to UQ. It's a great opportunity to be here and present my work to you all. I have to say, when Eloise first contacted me to see if I was free in March, I panicked a little and thought, I don't know if I can present something by March, but I have a deadline in the sense that I'm moving to Sri Lanka in the middle of the year, in July, for 3 years. So I feel as though I need to get as much opportunity as I can to present my work before I go. So I took this opportunity, and it was actually a great impetus to get me to write some things down on paper. So as Nikki mentioned, the paper I'm presenting today is part of a larger project that focuses on the politics of memory in post-conflict Timor-Leste and Aceh. And in the broader sense, my project seeks to examine the diverse ways in which people in these societies are socially remembering their respective periods of conflict. For example, by constructing monuments and memorials, organising commemorations, and ritually reburying the dead. And when I speak of social memory or social remembering, I'm drawing on the insights of memory studies scholarship, which starts from the perspective that remembering is always, at least in part, a social act that involves the ongoing reinterpretation of the past in the light of present-day preoccupations and interests. So specifically, my project is interested in exploring the strategies deployed by a diverse group of actors, I call them memory activists, to promote the ongoing social remembrance of particular incidents and individuals. I'm interested in what appears to motivate these actors, why some strategies succeed and others do not, to whom such practices of remembering are addressed, and their effects. And today I want to focus on one particular category of memory activists, human rights activists, who are promoting forms of remembering that are linked to a broader transitional justice agenda. This is actually a really great time for me to get feedback, as I'm in the process of reflecting on some fieldwork material using different theoretical lenses. And today I'm particularly interested in what a spatial lens might enable me to see in my fieldwork findings. So I'd stress that I'm still in the very early stages of thinking about these ideas, and I very much appreciate your thoughts and comments. So before I provide a bit of an outline of this presentation, I just want to note that as cases, Timor-Leste and Aceh, which lie opposite ends of the Indonesian archipelago, offer some very interesting points of comparison. Both societies have emerged relatively recently from protracted periods of conflict during which rebel groups, Fretilin and its armed wing Falantil in Timor-Leste's case, the Free Aceh movement or GAM in Aceh's case, fought for succession from Indonesia. Yet these conflicts were resolved with very different outcomes and through very different processes. In Timor-Leste's case, national independence was achieved in 2002 after a UN-sponsored referendum in 1999 and a 2.5-year period during which the UN had overall responsibility for the administration of the territory. Transitional justice mechanisms were promoted as a key element of the UN-led state-building process, and 2 different mechanisms were established at that time, a hybrid serious crimes prosecutions process and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Aceh's case, the conflict ended with a negotiated settlement in 2005, in which the province was granted special autonomy within Indonesia. An EU-led Aceh monitoring mission was deployed to monitor the implementation of a memorandum of understanding that was signed in Helsinki and marked the beginning of the peace process. However, the mission was not charged with the exclusive administration of the province as in Timor-Leste, and no transitional justice mechanisms were established during the peace process. The peace process also coincided with a massive international humanitarian response to the 2006 Boxing Day tsunami, which took the lives of 165,000 people in a single day. So in terms of my presentation today, I want to start by briefly making some points about the relationship between memory, spatiality and power, and clarify my use of key terms such as space and place. I then want to look at how memorialisation has become increasingly incorporated into the discourse and practice of transitional justice, and examine the assumptions and spatial imaginaries that are implied. In the second half of the paper, I want to focus on my observations of the social memory practices promoted by human rights activists in Timor-Leste and Aceh. And as I'll argue, these actors are engaged in a process that on the one hand unsettles dominant memory narratives, but on the other hand promotes patterns of remembering that remain tethered to imaginings of the nation state as an idealised space. So let me start with a brief anecdote, though, of an experience in Aceh that was one of several experiences that sparked my thinking about the importance of looking at social memory through the lens of spatiality. Last year, my research assistant Rizki and I observed the annual commemoration of the Simpang KKA massacre, which was organised by the North Aceh Human Rights Victims Community, or Kedua Hau, on May the 3rd in Lok Samaway, North Aceh. The Simpang KKA massacre is thought to have been the worst killing that took place during the decades-long Aceh conflict. It took place at a busy intersection, or Simpang, on the 3rd of May 1999, not far from the Kertaskraft Aceh, or KKA, a pulp and paper mill. Indonesian military forces fired on a crowd of citizens in retaliation for a soldier who had reportedly gone missing in the area a few days earlier, killing 21 people and wounding many others. Until now, none of the perpetrators have been arrested and tried for this incident, and many different versions of the event, the militaries, GAMs and human rights activists, continue to circulate. I was told by members of Kedua Hau that the public commemoration of this incident began in 2007 after the peace process, but before this that people had been quietly remembering the dead during Thursday night Quranic recitations at the village ballet meeting place and during their prayers at home. So, just to give you a sense of this, the first part of the commemoration took place in the morning in the house of a tunku, or religious leader, whose son had been killed in the Simpang KKA incident. We sat around on plastic mats outside the house under some shade cloths, the men in a large circle, the women in another. There were around 50 people present. Following some rousing speeches from members of Kedua Hau, which called for the need for the state to bring the perpetrators of the killings to justice, there was a long religious chant which mentioned the names of the dead. Following the prayers, there was a communal feast, or kenduri. We then walked to visit the grave of the tunku's son. It was in a small grave site hidden amongst the coconut trees. Some more prayers were conducted there, led by the tunku. The second phase of the commemoration took place at the site of the Simpang KKA massacre. A monument has been built there, yet it is located at a busy intersection which prevents it from being a place where people might stop and reflect. It was built during the post-conflict reconstruction of the province in 2011. Temporarily, on the morning of May the 3rd last year, some of the traffic was slowed, Students walked over to the centre of the intersection holding up homemade signs made out of cardboard demanding justice and a banner. This was more of a demonstration rather than a commemoration, and there seemed to be a celebratory mood in the air, but also a slight sense of tension. A man in plain clothes, who turned out to be military intelligence, questioned Rizki, my research assistant, about my presence as the sole foreigner at the event, and tapped her answers into his mobile phone. Later on, we heard that the organiser of the event was called to the police station to answer questions. Interestingly, we later learned about and set eyes on a second monument about 100 metres down the road from the monument where we had gathered. This monument had not played any part during the commemoration. It contains a list of GAM combatants from North Aceh who were killed in the conflict and seems to have been built by members of the district parliament to memorialise GAM's heroic role. A little further down the road again is one of the TNI's ubiquitous military posts that provides a stark symbol of the continuing presence of the military in everyday life. This experience was a reminder that memories of violent incidents are always integrally linked to particular geographic locations, and yet they can at the same time be anchored in multiple spatial imaginaries, from the intimate space of the family to broader collectives such as the nation-state. It also brought home to me that while there is much at stake in embedding memory narratives in the physical landscape through bricks and mortar monuments and memorials, this in itself does not ensure their continuity. Memories must also be socially performed, which involves the constant remaking of space. What also emerges from this brief anecdote is that the potential for friction amongst diverse memory narratives is more apparent when memories are performed within certain kinds of spatial imaginaries. In this case, it was the demonstration at the monument that attempted to draw the Simpang Kaka'a incident into a national imaginary that gained the attention of the Indonesian military intelligence, rather than the event held at the Tunku's house. I now want to spend a little bit of time discussing the related concepts of space and place and consider how they are linked to questions of power and social memory. And I think this is important because the so-called spatial turn that has taken place in the humanities and social sciences has had a profound influence on how both space and place are understood. Following the work of scholars such as Doreen Massey, David Harvey and Edward Soja, space is increasingly viewed not as a container or static background, but as socially constructed. It's now recognised that although there is a materiality to space, space is also shaped by ideas, experiences and practices, and is dynamic and relational. Space is also understood to be performative in the sense that, as Conlon puts it, and I quote, it conveys messages about how a space ought to be used, and a shared understanding of this message is assumed, end quote. These understandings of space have begun to be influential in the two areas of scholarship that I engage particularly closely with in this project, the Memory Studies Scholarship and the Peace and Conflict Studies Scholarship. They've also been influential in recent anthropological scholarship on the state, in which the state is treated as an idea rather than a pre-existing territorial entity that needs to be continually reproduced through everyday performances and practices of statehood. Related to these rethinkings of space, place is no longer thought of only as a geographic location, but as a fusion of social and material worlds. I find Edward Soja's definition of place to be particularly useful. Soja defines place as a particular form of space, one that is created through acts of naming, as well as the distinctive activities and imaginings associated with particular social spaces. In relation to social memory then, we might think about space becoming transformed into a place of memory through spatial practices that invest a particular space with meaning. To create places of memory, or to emplace memory, as Robinson puts it, is to make memory socially visible. Because space is dynamic and relational, it is imbued with power dynamics. As Komarova and O'Dowd put it, power relations are enacted spatially, and the organisation of space is the outcome of power relations, end quote. This is particularly apparent in conflict and post-conflict environments, where territory can be carved up according to what Highgate and Henry referred to as military cartographic principles that serve tactical and strategic purposes. For example, UN peacekeeping missions transform space into peacekeeping landscapes composed of UN headquarters, zones and checkpoints. And while this can produce a sense of security for some, it also influences everyday experiences of and access to space in ways that can be profoundly gendered. In relation to social memory, the relationship between power and space is apparent in the fact that not all actors have the same capacity to emplace memory into the social imaginary and the built environment. Political elites with superior access to resources have the capacity to selectively draw upon memories in their efforts to perform the state as a coherent entity and promote their own legitimacy. The establishment of museums and memorials and military cemeteries, for instance, helps to consolidate the power of modern states by projecting an illusion of permanence and territorial fixity, and a state that both sits above and contains its localities, regions and communities, as Ferguson and Gupta put it. At the same time, attempts to emplace memory and to carve up space are never all-encompassing, because space is not static but dynamic. As Doreen Massey's work powerfully highlights, space is multiple and is always in the process of being made through social relations and material practices. Space can be inscribed with various layers of meaning that are not always visible to all and can be used and interpreted in multiple ways. And while space is subject to ongoing boundary work by those who would seek to restrict the kinds of actors and activities that are permitted, others seek to expand those boundaries or emplace their own versions of events into space. All of this means that it's important to consider the multiple spatialities that are at play in the context of remembering and the frictions that can emerge between them. The extent to which space, power and social memory are intertwined is powerfully apparent in both Timor-Leste and Aceh. Since Timor-Leste gained its independence, the dominant narrative of the conflict that is being spatially performed is a militarised masculine story of heroic liberation. This story, which celebrates the achievement of a national independence as a culmination of 500 years of struggle against successive colonial occupiers, memorialises the heroes and martyrs of the resistance struggle. This narrative is embodied in monuments like this one of the former Fredland founder Nicolau Lobato, and the Garden of Heroes Cemetery, where the remains of former Falantur veterans are buried. So, for instance, the Nicolau Lobato statue is located at the main intersection of the airport to the main road into Dili. It's one of the first images that visitors see, and as such it seems to be directed as much to an international as a national audience. The Garden of Heroes Cemetery is also located in Dili district, and not coincidentally, it is right next door to the newly established East Timorese military barracks. There is now an attempt to establish hero cemeteries in an identical style all across Timor-Leste's 13 districts. Together, these cemeteries speak to an attempt to perform an image of a state that owns those who died for the nation and is equally present in each district. However, the dominant memorial landscape also spatially reflects and performs the political importance of the Indonesia relationship to East Timor. So, for example, it is interesting that recent memorialising efforts do not, by and large, displace Indonesia's own efforts at memorialisation. The National Indonesian Cemetery, for example, remains in place and is well tended, and a shiny new Indonesian cultural centre now stands in a prominent position in Dili. Aceh's conflict ended very differently from Timor-Leste's, with the granting of special autonomy within Indonesia rather than independence. So it's perhaps not surprising, therefore, that there is an absence of memorials to remember GAM resistance heroes. The remains of the fallen GAM combatants are not gathered in centralised places, but lie in these discrete makam suhada, or heroes' graves, which are scattered in unmarked places throughout the landscape. In addition, what constitutes the dominant narrative of the conflict in Aceh is far more ambiguous, negotiated and at times contested than in Timor-Leste. Different sources of authority, namely the Indonesian state and military and former GAM, many of whom are now in positions of power in the provincial government, make different claims to legitimacy, in which they emphasise their central roles in delivering the peace and reconstructing the province. For instance, the military's ubiquitous slogans of Damai itu indah, or peace is beautiful, and Bersama Rakyat Tini Kuat, together with the community Tini is strong, are displayed on its regional, district and sub-district commands across the province. You'll see these everywhere, David, when you go there. These claims not only seek to reinvent the military's role as peacemaker, but both spatially reflect and perform the ongoing presence and the economic and military power of the military in everyday life. GAM has similarly sought to reinvent itself as peacemaker, promoting its role as the author of the Helsinki MOU that has delivered peace and prosperity to the population, and further cementing its claim to power through reference to its leadership of the 30-year-long struggle for Aceh's independence. Achenese are adept at navigating these different narratives. For instance, they dutifully attend events marking Indonesian Independence Day on August the 17th. At the same time, many continue to informally commemorate the 6th of December, which marks the day that GAM was founded in 1976, by visiting the Makam Suhada, or heroes' graves. And from time to time, they risk raising the GAM flag, which remains illegal. However, as I mentioned earlier, while space is shaped by power dynamics, it is never fully bound by them. It always retains some element of the chaotic and the unpredictable, and frictions can emerge between different spatial imaginaries. One source of friction with dominant spatial imaginaries of memory both in Timor-Leste and Aceh comes from the globalised discourse of transitional justice, which is deployed by human rights activists in their efforts to promote social memory projects in both contexts. Before discussing these dynamics, I now want to briefly discuss how memorialisation has become central to the transitional justice framework and look at some of the assumptions and the spatial imaginaries that underpin this. Transitional justice, as we all well know, is a fast-growing field of both practice and scholarship. As a practice, it prescribes a set of techniques and mechanisms that purport to assist states emerging from authoritarian rule or from periods of protracted conflict to confront and resolve large-scale human rights abuses. This goal is underpinned by a set of teleological assumptions that share much in common with the discourse of liberal peace-building, namely that the promotion of the liberal values of rule of law and human rights will assist states to transition to peaceful liberal democracies. And as several scholars have observed, criminal prosecutions remain the backbone of transitional justice responses, and the field remains dominated by a narrative of legalism. Yet at the same time, there has in recent years been an increasing interest in developing more locally resonant and holistic transitional justice responses. This shift is evident in the attempts to combine prosecutions with other mechanisms such as truth commissions, reparations programs, institutional reform, missing persons commissions, local justice practices, and quite recently, memorialisation. I must confess I'm a little ambivalent about the emerging interest in holistic transitional justice responses, of which the focus on memorialisation is a part. On the one hand, it could be welcomed as heralding a shift away from the legalism and top-down responses that have dominated the transitional justice field. On the other hand, however, it points to the expansion and normalisation of transitional justice and the extent to which certain standardised practices, ideas and assumptions now travel the globe as a kind of mobile transitional justice toolkit. In other words, rather than marking a fundamental reshaping of transitional justice assumptions, the growing emphasis on memorialisation could be understood as heralding its mainstreaming within the transitional justice toolkit. Alongside trials and truth commissions, it now helps to legitimise a general set of claims about the necessity to address violent pasts in order to facilitate successful transitions. And this growing embrace of memorialisation can be seen in the emerging number of reports by UN agencies and international NGOs on the topic. Expertise and financing for national and local memory projects and sites are now provided by foreign experts, governments and international NGOs, and truth commissions often make specific recommendations for memorialisation, as was the case in Timor-Leste. In a provocative recent article, Lee David suggests that these developments indicate that increasingly standardised approaches to memorialisation are emerging, in which a proper way to remember is prescribed and in which certain assumptions are taken for granted. And within the transitional justice, I think memorialisation can be linked to at least 4 assumptions. The first is that memorialisation will provide a form of symbolic reparations to victims. The social expression of memory through commemorations, monuments and memorials is thought to give victims or their family members a clear sign that their story is not forgotten, but rather integrated into and made visible as part of a national social memory. The second assumption is that memorialisation will contribute to victims' rights to truth, In other words, that it will act as a means of truth recovery. A third assumption is that memorialisation will contribute to the eventual goal of criminal prosecutions. The idea is that memorials, museums and commemorations can, by making victims and crimes visible to a wider public, awaken a conscience for their suffering, which might then lead to a change of opinion and a greater public demand to put perpetrators of human rights violations to trial. A fourth and related assumption is that remembering will have a pedagogical power that will help prevent future abuses. The past is seen as offering lessons which can be abstracted in order to prevent future injustices. Only by remembering atrocities, it is argued, will the society in question learn not to repeat them. The pedagogical power of memorialisation also extends to the idea that social remembering will encourage forms of active citizenship, tolerance and democratic dialogue. The underlying idea, as Bevanage puts it, and I quote, is to create memorial institutions that enact the values and norms the new society is to be built upon, and to educate the public, particularly the young, in empathy, tolerance and critical thinking, end quote. These assumptions highlight, I think, that there is a tension at play between a vision of memorialisation that stresses victims' universal rights to reparations, justice and truth, and a vision of memorialisation that sees memory as an important resource in the consolidation and strengthening of the post-conflict state and the renewal of the polity. This is a tension that is inherent in transitional justice discourse generally, which, as Jeffrey and Jakala point out, and I quote, exhibits the desire to promote both state building and the transnational impulses of humanitarian law, end quote. It is a tension that is particularly marked in contexts where transitional justice is promoted as part of an externally led peace building or state building of intervention, as occurred in Timor-Leste, where the state building goals of transitional justice appear to be preeminent. In these contexts, the legitimacy of these mechanisms is often an issue. Civil society is seen as an indispensable resource in the successful localisation of transitional justice because, as Vasuki Nasaya puts it, it helps to balance potential charges of imperial hubris. This is reflected in the policy literature on memorialisation, in which it is suggested that civil society can help to mobilise groups of the population, grant popular legitimacy, organise events and generate public debates. There is also an assumption that civil society will help to challenge and break the hegemonic memory culture imposed by national elites by promoting alternative narratives and encouraging renewed forms of active citizenship. As these assumptions suggest, then, quite a lot is expected of civil society, and this is an issue that I will return to. Specifically, in a context in which transitional justice practice has become increasingly standardised and professionalised, a particular kind of civil society actor is required, what Jeffrey has referred to as a gentrified civil society that is capable of negotiating with donors and state officials, writing project proposals, and networking with international human rights organisations, and is also committed to both popular participation and supporting the state-building enterprise. I now want to turn to the social memory activism that's being undertaken by human rights activists in Aceh and Timor. Specifically, I want to consider how these activists are attempting to navigate the divergent discourses that are embodied in the statements and actions of political elites and the transitional justice template and their associated spatial imaginaries. But firstly, though, who are these activists that I'm discussing here? In both contexts, they're comprised of a relatively small group of educated urban elites who tend to be of a younger generation from the current generation of political leaders. They tend to be employed as staff of prominent local NGOs and are well networked amongst each other and amongst human rights NGOs in Indonesia and internationally. And in both Timor-Leste and Aceh, these activists have been engaged in a range of different social memory practices that seek to promote the visibility of events that took place during their respective conflicts. These practices encompass a number of interlinked activities, from fundraising, lobbying, supporting local victims groups with small amounts of funding and training, to activities that have a performative element, such as public commemorations, protests, and the construction of monuments and memorial sites. And one of the things that I find interesting is that there's a remarkable similarity in terms of the kind of practices that are promoted by activists in both contexts, despite their very different contexts. So in addition to the commemoration of the Simpankaka massacre in Aceh that I described earlier, Achenese activists are promoting commemorations at other sites of violence. These include the Rumah Gedung, a large house in Pidir district that was used by the Indonesian military as a place of torture between 1997 and 1998, and Jambul Kupuk, a village in South Aceh where 12 men were shot and burned alive in a house by the military in May 2003. Similar activities take place in Timor-Leste, where activists organise commemorations of incidents such as the Likisa Church massacre that occurred in April 1999, where up to 60 people were killed by members of a local militia group, and the Swai Church massacre that took place in September 1999, when up to 200 people were killed by both Indonesian military and local militia only days after the announcement of the referendum results. At the site of the Likisa Church massacre, a small monument of an angel was built in 2006 by the local victims group with the support of human rights activists. The monument was inaugurated with a ceremony involving the blessing of stones to put the souls of the dead to rest, including the souls of the many bodies that have yet to be recovered after being taken away from the massacre site and presumably dumped at sea. And the Likisa monument, I think, is particularly illustrative of the point I made earlier that spaces are inscribed with various layers of meaning and imbued with multiple reference. On the one hand, this monument fashions an intimate spatiality. It offers a quiet place of reflection and provides a site at which families who have been unable to recover the remains of their loved ones can pray to a Christian God and to the spirits of their ancestors. And as you can see, this monument is not built in a large square militaristic style like many of the state-sponsored monuments in Timor. But on the other hand, this monument is now incorporated into large annual commemorations that are held at the site on the day of the massacre, that are organised by members of the Likisa Victims Group with the support of Dili-based activists. Members of the National Parliament and senior government figures are often invited to these commemorations, which become opportunities for lobbying. For instance, a few years ago, the commemoration coincided with the presentation of a petition to the National Parliament on behalf of families of victims, which called for the Parliament to recognise the 6th of April nationally as a historical day, provide reparations to families of the dead, and pressure the international community to establish an international tribunal to prosecute members of the Indonesian military who committed human rights abuses at Likisa. The social memory practices of human rights activists are integrally linked then to a broader advocacy agenda. Specifically, they have become a political resource in the fostering of victim identities and the building of a victim's constituency in order to lobby the state for specific transitional justice interventions. I now want to make a few remarks about what I think this kind of social memory activism makes possible and what I think it constrains. So on the one hand, I want to argue that human rights activists in Aceh and Timor-Leste are attempting to create spaces of justice through public performances that seek to emplace alternative memories in the public imaginary. In both contexts, there is a deliberate attempt to disrupt state-sponsored narratives that foster public amnesia about the violence experienced by civilians, and instead foster open discussion of these silence narratives. They also seek to transform the militarised social spaces that once shaped the effective climate of everyday life in both Timor-Leste and Aceh, and to some extent continues, particularly in Aceh. These attempts are also suggestive of a desire to foster new forms of solidarity amongst victims and an active citizenry that is capable of exercising and demanding rights from the state. But on the other hand, I think it's important to inquire into the vision of justice that is being imagined through these social memory practices and the ways in which this vision is linked to the discursive framework of transitional justice. And specifically, I want to argue that activists struggle to break free from what Mitchell has termed a methodological nationalism, which presumes the nation-state to be the appropriate container for social and political life. This methodological nationalism is linked, I suggest, to the implicit spatial imaginary of transitional justice, which treats states as the appropriate site of human rights protection. This methodological nationalism is apparent in the fact that while different and often overlapping goals and spatial imaginaries are at play during the commemorations I have just described, the desire to speak to the state and to draw specific local memories into a national story is a common theme. There is also an emphasis on the pedagogical power of memorialisation for the nation, a suggestion that the public remembrance of past violence will help propel a shift to a protective, open and democratic state. These themes emerged strongly in several of my interviews with activists. For example, as Sisto in Timor-Leste put it, "We want to nationalise these issues, not just keep them local. The point," he explained, "it's not just to tell stories and cry. We can learn from the past to strengthen our independence." End of quote. In Aceh, Lauhan explained that activists stepped up their support for several commemorations in Aceh last year in an effort to support the work of the newly established Provincial Truth Commission, which they saw as an important step in the long road towards achieving prosecutions of the Indonesian military. As he explained, and I quote, "We want to show the government that there is support for the victims. We also want to push the government to give the commissioners of the new TRC a chance." End quote. The link between memorialisation and the nation state is also evident in the fact that in my interviews with both Timorese and Achenese activists, strong views were expressed that the government, in Timor-Leste's case the national government and in Aceh's case the provincial government, should take responsibility for organising commemorations. It is not fair, they suggest, that victims groups should have to organise these events themselves. It places too much of a burden on them. They argue that if governments took responsibility for commemorations, this would provide a form of national public recognition to victims, even if the activists in both contexts concede that governments do not have a good track record in terms of consulting the population on public events. This methodological nationalism creates frustrations for activists and members of victims groups for at least two reasons. The first is that to reframe incidents as events of national significance, to accord them a specific significance within the spatiality of the nation state, brings memory practices directly into dialogue with the state and nation building agendas of political elites. In a context in which these agendas are resistant to activists' transitional justice demands in the Timor-Leste case, or downright antagonistic in the case of Aceh, members of victims groups express a sense of weariness and disappointment about the fact that their expectations for prosecutions, and more importantly concrete material assistance, continue to be raised yet remain unmet. This disappointment resonates with common narrative tropes that circulate in both Timor-Leste and Aceh, which suggest that while former resistance fighters have enjoyed the spoils of peace, ordinary people continue to be neglected by the state. Secondly, organising commemorations on an annual basis requires activists to accumulate the requisite funding, social capital and legitimacy, which is an ongoing struggle. Activists in both Timor-Leste and Aceh expressed frustrations with the lack of resources to ensure the continuation of annual commemorations, which requires funding for transport to bring families of victims based in disparate villages together, and food. In Timor-Leste, there is a sense that 15 years on from the UN-sponsored state-building mission, donors are no longer interested in funding transitional justice activities, including memorialisation. In Aceh, funding for local NGOs has also dried up significantly since the post-tsunami humanitarian response, and donors now channel their Aceh funding through national NGOs. To expand their reach and to facilitate the localisation of commemorations, activists in both contexts have attempted to support the formation of local victims groups. These groups are expected to liaise directly with local governments to secure support and funding. But in contexts of material deprivation, poor roads, lack of transport and competing priorities, members of local victims groups do not appear to be emerging as the kind of self-reliant active citizens capable of demanding their rights from the state that activists would like them to be. In addition, they do not always possess the requisite social and symbolic capital to make commemorations happen locally. For instance, they do not often have the resistance credentials or the links to powerful political figures that are important in both Aceh and Timor. So So in the context of the Lea commemorations, for instance, it's been interesting to observe how the spatial imaginaries associated with these commemorations have shifted over the years due to the growing influence and involvement of a number of charismatic former resistance veterans who do possess these social connections. When the commemorations first began, most of the activity was centred around the church and the monument where the massacre took place. Now, following the church service, people walk to the newly constructed Lea Heroes Cemetery, which you can see there, and the ossuary, which is where the remains are temporarily kept. And through speeches made by the political elite, the dead are now incorporated into the state-sponsored heroic narrative. The attempt to reframe memories as part of a national imaginary also constrains the kinds of events that are selected for commemoration and the ways in which this remembering takes place. People are invited to remember the past in new registers and in ways that flatten and simplify complex experiences. In other words, it encourages a particular kind of instrumentalisation of memory. So, for example, in Timor-Leste, activists have encouraged victims groups in each district to choose one violent event that can be representative of all the events in that district. And they've been told they should choose events in which 10 or more people were killed. In Aceh, activists are prioritising the commemoration of violent events that have been investigated by the National Human Rights Commission, Komnas HAM, and have been referred to the Attorney General's Office for potential prosecution. And in both contexts, there is a prioritisation of spaces that are likely to gain national visibility. For instance, incidents are chosen that took place close to a main road or that are accessible to political elites and the media. And in Timor-Leste, activists have become increasingly frustrated with the lack of willingness of the political elite to travel to remote areas of the country and have recently come up with the creative suggestion that the government could centrally construct 13 small memorials in the capital city, Dili, to represent the violence that took place in each district. And to show their respects, politicians could visit these small memorials on significant days and offer 1 minute's silence in the parliament. And I think while this move seeks to draw local events even more into a national imaginary, it would, if successful, also remove them completely from the spatiality of the local community. The final and probably most important point that I want to make, and I'll end here because I know we're running out of time, is that attempts to reframe memories within the spatial imaginary of the nation state have the potential to overlook the plural and diverse ways in which people remember their pasts that may be grounded in very different spatial imaginaries. My fieldwork findings suggest that a great deal of memory work that occurs in the realm of the everyday is overlooked when there is a focus on building certain kinds of communities of memory, for instance victims groups that are linked to a national spatiality and a legalistic transitional justice imaginary. So in both Timor-Leste and Aceh, much remembering seems to take place in the intimate space of the extended family and is not intended for a public audience. It is memory that is embodied, expressed orally and through ritual, and is maintained through relationships with kin and with the landscape rather than anchored in memorials. Remembering often seems to occur as part of a broader process of fulfilling obligations to the dead, and in this sense perhaps should not really be called remembering at all. So to conclude, the efforts of human rights activists in Timor-Leste and Aceh to promote social memory practices reveal a paradox. The paradox is that while activists openly challenge state-sanctioned narratives of the past, which eclipse civilians' experiences of violence, they simultaneously reproduce the idea of the state as an idealised space. This tension speaks to the influence of this discursive framework of transitional justice, which imagines the state as the natural container for social remembering and the delivery of a narrow judicial form of justice. And because this discursive framework celebrates the roles of civil society in contributing to the renewal of the polity, it requires activists to spend much of their time and energy seeking to accumulate the required social, economic and symbolic capital to influence state priorities. Perhaps the most problematic outcome of this is that it has the potential to remove these activities from the diverse priorities and spatial imaginaries of the local communities with whom they work.
Thank you, they're masterful, I think. So many beautiful ideas and concepts and very neatly tied together at the end. So thank you. It was really very stimulating from my perspective. But yeah, I would like to now open it up to